Hey everyone, how's it going? Powen here and welcome back to my garage. It is awesome to have you guys here for another DIY technical video by ACUITY Instruments. So in today's video, we're going to be installing the ACUITY Instruments Curl Control Cold Air Intake for the 9th Gen Honda Civic. This video is filmed to supplement the official install guide for this cold air intake that is available on the ACUITY Instruments website, so I'll leave a link in the video description below if you choose to check that out yourself. So it is important to note, and we can't stress this enough, you have to retune your car after installing this intake in order to compensate for the increased mass airflow, or else you will risk engine damage. We're not going to be covering the actual tuning process in this video because of the variety of ways you can tune these cars. I do know that the owner of this 9th Gen Civic right behind me will be using the Honda Flash Pro system in order to apply a base map that compensates for a 3.5-inch intake system. So with that all being said, let's go to the unboxing of this cold air intake to show you guys all the parts you should be receiving in the kit, and then I'll go over all the tools you'll be needing to perform the installation.
In the box, you should expect the following parts, starting with the carbon fiber inlet tube. Next, you should find a silicone throttle body coupler, followed by another silicone coupler elbow. In a separate box, you should find an aluminum velocity stack with a 6-inch cone filter. Next, you should also have a battery relocation tray in a sealed plastic bag, followed by another bag containing a silicone breather hose and silicone coolant bypass hose. There's also a bag of hose clamps for all the new intake tubing and coolant bypass line. There should also be a bag with a mounting bracket, rubber isolation mount, and screws, bolts, and washers to affix the intake to the chassis of the car. Lastly, we have a sealed bag with the wiring extension harnesses for the stock MAF sensor and battery sensor. Now for this installation, you're going to need a set of plastic pry tools, a set of flat and Phillips head screwdrivers, a channel lock wrench, needle nose pliers, a pick tool, a ratchet wrench, a breaker bar or impact wrench, 10, 12, and 17 mm hex sockets, a 10 mm closed end wrench, and a 6 to 12 inch socket extension. You're also going to need a torque wrench, electrical tape, a blade or knife, a floor jack, extra coolant for your car, and a drain pan.
So this entire installation should really only take you 2 to 3 hours depending on how experienced you are with working on cars. So with that all being said, let's get right into the installation of this cold air intake.
To begin this install, pop open your hood and locate the front bumper cover. Next, remove the 8 plastic clips using trim tools or a flathead screwdriver. The clips can be pulled out after prying the center fastener outward as shown. If any clips break during this process, a pick tool can help pull the broken fastener out. Next, use an Allen socket to remove the 2 screws on either side of the cover as shown. Then separate the cover from the front bumper and remove it from the car. On the inside driver's side wheel well, locate and remove the plastic fasteners that affix the fender liner to the chassis of the car. Then on each side of the front bumper, remove the Phillips head screws that attach the bumper to each fender. And just below, on the bottom corners of the front bumper, remove an additional plastic clip. Then proceed to remove the following screws and plastic clips that fasten the bumper to the underbody panels using a hex socket and flathead screwdriver. Most of these clips resemble the previous plastic clips removed for the plastic bumper cover. Now to protect your headlights from any accidental scratches, you can choose to apply some masking tape on the bottom edges of each headlight before you remove the front bumper. To remove the bumper, start off on one side and then grip the bumper just under the fender as shown. Pull away from the car so that the bumper unclips from the fender and from under the headlights. Repeat this process on the other side and then support the weight of the bumper so that you can unclip each wiring connector from each fog light. Then put the entire front bumper aside. Now use a hex socket to loosen the battery ground clamp. Pull the ground clamp from the negative battery terminal and then place it aside. Repeat this process to remove the battery clamp on the positive battery terminal. Next, push a 10 mm socket into the plastic harness clip to release it from the battery J-bolt as shown. Unthread the remaining plastic nut, and then use the 10 mm socket to remove the 2 nuts securing the battery hold-down bracket. Then remove each of the J-bolts, unhooking them from the lower battery tray. Then remove any surrounding plastic from the battery, and then remove the battery out from the car. Remove any plastic from underneath the battery as well. Now locate the two hose clamps on the intake tube that feeds the throttle body. First loosen the clamp closest to the airbox, and then pull that intake tube free. Then loosen the clamp closest to the throttle body and pull the tube from the throttle body. Now use a pair of pliers to squeeze open a clamp on the top side of the intake tube in order to pull out the valve cover breather hardline from the intake tube. Then set the intake tube aside. Depress the locking tab on the wiring connector to separate it from the MAF sensor, then unclip the wiring harness from the airbox using needle nose pliers as shown. Now remove the two screws on either side of the MAF sensor so that you can pull the sensor out from the airbox. Now transfer the MAF sensor into the new carbon intake tube, reinstalling the MAF sensor into the aluminum MAF sensor mount using the original screws to secure it in place. Moving on to the airbox assembly, release the two locking tabs at the front of the airbox, and then remove the upper half of the airbox, exposing the air filter. For more clearance under the workspace, unclip the harness for the positive battery clamp from the metal bracket next to the ECU. Then remove the plastic air tube that connects into the bottom half of the airbox and into another air tube that is attached to the battery tray base. Now remove the screw that secures the lower half of the airbox to the battery tray base. Then take both hands and grip either side of the lower airbox and pull upwards to separate it off of the two rubber mounting posts just under the airbox assembly. Remove the two screws that affix the lower intake tube to the battery tray base. Then remove this lower intake tube from the car by separating it from the lower resonator chamber. Now disconnect the wiring connector from the battery sensor. Then remove the following screw that affixes the battery ground cable to the chassis of the car. Now remove the plastic harness clamp that secures the battery ground cable next to the battery sensor connector. Then set these parts aside. Now slide the plastic cover off of the ECU, then remove the two screws that secure the ECU to the battery tray base and then to the chassis of the car. Now behind the ECU, remove each of the three wiring harness connectors by pushing down on each of their locking tabs and then rotating their locking collars back as shown. Then unclip the harness from the two mounting tabs and then separate the ECU from this harness and set it aside. Remove the two following screws on the top side of the battery tray. Then remove the two remaining screws underneath the battery tray and then pull the tray straight up and out of the car to set it aside. Now because we will be installing a coolant bypass line and detaching the upper radiator hose, it is necessary to drain some or all the coolant from the cooling system. Start by sliding a jack and drain pan underneath the front of the car. Move the jack just under where the transmission mates to the engine block as shown. Jack up to this point just enough to support the weight of the transmission. Once you are sure the engine is cool, remove the radiator cap as shown. Center the drain pan underneath the white radiator drain plug, then loosen the drain plug by hand or with a pair of pliers until the coolant starts draining from the radiator. Let just enough coolant to drain from the radiator so that the upper radiator hose is completely empty. Then tighten up the drain plug and reinstall the radiator cap. Next, we need to reroute the battery's positive terminal wiring harness such that it goes over the upper radiator hose. Start by depressing a locking tab on the brown harness clamp as shown, and then remove it from the metal tab on the chassis. Disconnect the wiring connector just above this metal tab as well. Place some towels underneath the radiator hose, then use some channel lock pliers to release the radiator hose clamp at the engine side of the upper radiator hose as shown. Disconnect the upper radiator hose from the engine, then move the wiring harness over the radiator hose. Now reconnect the upper radiator hose and then replace the hose clamp. Remove the plastic clamp from the positive battery terminal wiring harness by prying on the small tabs on either side of it with a small screwdriver or pick tool, then remove the clamp from the wiring harness. Unwrap the electrical tape that holds the harness closed and pull out the wire for the connector that we removed from step 10. Once about 4 to 6 inches of this wire is pulled out from the harness, double check that this is enough slack to plug the connector back in when the rest of the harness is reinstalled on the newly relocated battery. Once you're happy with this, then seal the harness back up with new electrical tape. Before proceeding to the next step, double check that the jack is still supporting the weight of the transmission. Then remove the 3 bolts securing the transmission mount to the chassis of the car. Place the new ACUITY battery tray on top of the transmission mount as shown. Then reinstall the 3 transmission mount bolts and then torque them down to spec. Now lower and then remove the jack from underneath the car. Then take the new MAF harness extension wiring and then clip the following connector to the battery tray on the tab marked MAF connector. Now attach the factory MAF connector to the end of the extension mounted on the battery tray. Make sure to separate the wiring from any remaining harness clips so that you can route it behind the battery tray before you plug it into the extension wiring. Then mount the factory ground cable that we removed previously to the following tab on the battery tray and then tighten down the battery cable ground screw to spec. With the new battery tray installed, reinstall the wiring harness back onto the ECU. Using the factory mounting screws, the bottom of the ECU is now secured to the forward-facing tab on the battery tray, with the top mounting point fastened into the factory location. Then replace the plastic ECU cover to complete the reinstallation of the ECU. Now place the battery onto the battery tray with the positive terminal facing forward. Then take the battery sensor extension wiring and connect the mating end to the battery sensor on the negative battery terminal harness clamp. Plug the other end into the original sensor connector that we unplugged from step 6. Now reinstall the plastic harness clamp that we removed earlier from the negative battery cable. Open the clamp using a pick tool or small flathead screwdriver. Use it to affix the battery sensor harness extension next to the negative battery cable as shown. Now that the battery is relocated, remove any remaining wiring harness clips that are no longer in use. Secure the positive battery terminal onto the battery as shown. Then reconnect the wiring connector that we pulled out from the positive terminal wiring harness into its factory location as shown. Then secure the negative battery terminal clamp to the battery using a close-end wrench. Now reinstall the J-bolts and the battery tie-down onto the battery and battery tray, then tighten the adjustment nuts on the battery tie-down bracket to secure the battery in place. At this point, if you'd like to neaten up the extension wiring, you can do so by zip tying them both onto the battery tray as shown. Next, we need to remove the breather tube assembly along with the following 3 coolant hoses. Use pliers to pull back the hose clamps on each of the hoses as shown. Disconnect the coolant hoses from the throttle body and the engine. Leave the shortest of the hoses connected to the hardline to prevent excess coolant from leaking. Then loosen the hose clamp on the valve cover breather tube to pull it free from the valve cover. Transfer 2 of the factory hose clamps onto the new tubing supplied in your kit. Now connect the tube to the following hose barbs on the engine. Then secure the tube in place with the factory hose clamps. Before we can install the new intake piping, we must remove the resonator chamber just from behind the driver's side of the front bumper. Remove the 2 screws that affix the resonator chamber to the chassis of the car. Then detach any remaining tubing from the resonator chamber to remove it from the car entirely. If you wish, you can also remove another air tube that is attached to the top of the resonator chamber. You can remove it by unscrewing the single hex screw that is clipped into the air tube that runs behind the fender. Now take the vibration dampening mount and screw it by hand into the frontmost mounting hole for the OEM battery tray. Next, we mount the intake support bracket onto the vibration dampening mount using the supplied washer and flange nut. Now don't tighten the nut down completely so that you can orient the bracket toward the front of the car for now. If you'd like to at this point, tidy up any loose wiring with zip ties as needed. Now take your air filter and loosely install the designated hose clamp around the air filter as shown. Place the velocity stack into the filter and then tighten the clamp down to secure it in place. Make sure that the velocity stack is installed just below the lip of the air filter as shown. Proceed to install the silicone couplers onto the carbon intake as shown. For this install, we are showing the couplers that fit our intake to a stock intake manifold with a stock throttle body. Please check out our website for the details on other couplers we offer for various aftermarket intake manifolds and throttle body configurations. Loosely install the supplied hose clamps onto the silicone couplers and then install the entire assembly onto the throttle body as shown. Then install the intake onto the bracket assembly that we previously mounted using the supplied screw and washer as shown. Make sure to take the time to realign any of the intake components necessary so that it doesn't make any contact with any component in the engine bay before you tighten down the entire assembly. For vehicles equipped with RBC or similar intake manifolds, you may need to loosen the following hose clamp on the upper radiator hose in order to rotate the hose in the direction shown to maximize the clearance between itself and the silicone throttle body coupler. Now install the filter assembly into the silicone elbow of the intake assembly. Adjust the filter until you are satisfied with how it fits, and then tighten down the hose clamp to secure it in place. Next, we need to install the supplied valve cover breather hose onto the valve cover and onto the barb that is located on the silicone throttle body coupler. Before tightening down any hose clamps, you may need to trim the hose as needed to avoid any sharp bends or kinks into this tube. Now finally, reconnect your MAF sensor and then proceed to reinstall the front bumper and top off your coolant.
Okay everybody, that pretty much wraps it up for today's video. Thanks again for watching, and I hope the contents of this video gives you guys a little bit more confidence in order to perform one of these installs yourself. So don't forget to drop a comment below if you have any feedback for us. Don't forget to like the video and also consider subscribing to the channel. Check us out on Instagram and Facebook as well to stay even more up to date with all of our products, install guides, videos, and even future products that we may tease here and there. That being said, my name is Pao and Song, and I will catch you guys in the next DIY tech video.